Good afternoon. Thank you for spending this beautiful day with us. My name's Anne Filippic. I'm the CEO of Share Strength, and just really excited to be here with all of you for our second hybrid session of the Conversations on Food Justice series. Since 2020, the Conversation on Food Justice series has provided a forum of rich conversation on the ways that food intersects with race, class, and equity. The series has reached thousands of audience members across the globe. I think we have some folks tuning in virtually today, shaping the narrative around food justice and access and informing our work as an anti-hunger organization at Share Our Strength. We know that the challenges facing our nation today are numerous and they're intersecting. And I hope that today's conversation is a reminder of the power of community and the importance of finding moments of beauty and joy as we do the hard work to solve some of our country and our world's most pressing challenges. And I will say that I really love this series and this panel in particular because I think it really speaks to the spirit of Share Our Strength and our founding story, which was the belief that everyone has a strength to share and that it will take individuals showing up in that authentic way and whatever their individual strength is to really solve these challenges. And I think our panelists represent that in the most beautiful ways. I want to give a special thank you to Katie Workman of our Leadership Council, the Share Our Strength Leadership Council, who's been a true partner in organizing the Conversations on Food Justice series. And also a big thank you to Corby Kummer, who I will be passing it over to momentarily, who is the moderator for today's session and our partner at the Aspen Institute as Food and Society Executive Director. So Corby, I'll hand it off to you.
And I have to start by recognizing our wonderful partner at Share Our Strength, Elliot Gaskins. And if the Zoom cameras can get him, he has to rise and take a bow because we would be nowhere. Plus, he's always the best dressed man at any occasion, and 3 men in a tie. This is the most you've seen men in ties since the pandemic. Since the pandemic started, no project at Food and Society at the Aspen Institute, or I hope Elliot's team and Katie at Share Our Strength has been more personally meaningful than our conversations on food justice. So that such a wonderful panel showed up in New York. They all traveled. We're all thrilled that they came because what could be more appropriate in New York City than to talk about the role of arts? And we are talking about the intersection with food and food justice. And we have such active artists in completely diverse mediums, which was the point of the panel today. So we're going to begin with pieces of art and images that each of our speakers chose. Hiram is going to be the very first reading a poem and either telling us before or after why you happen to choose this poem of yours, active poet, to read to us and reading us the poem. Then we'll be seeing slides and images of Stephen's own work and then some photographs that Vaughn has chosen from a cookbook she's working on. Hiram.
Thank you, Corby. Before I start, I would like to just acknowledge the fact that as far as I know, this is one of the first panels ever to take a look, explore the notion of bringing the arts into the food discussion, food justice especially, and in my case, hunger discussion. So really, really hats off to Share Our Strength and to the Aspen Institute for having the vision to do this. I've chosen a poem, excuse me, taken from the Poetry X Hunger website, which I hope to describe them briefly here a little bit later on. This is a poem that was written by BrianDonnell James, who lives in Manassas, Virginia. It won the 2020 World Food Day Poetry Competition. The Poetry X Hunger offered in partnership with the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. I think you'll see why this poem won the prize. If you really want to hear it read beautifully, movingly by the poet, go to the Poetry X Hunger website and search for BrianDonnell James. It'll pop up, and I guarantee you'll be moved by this poem. I'm going to do my best at rendering it for you. It's titled Testimony. I was a teenage father then with little money. My wife and I saved our lunch so our son could eat. And we went without a meal that day. As night approached, we had hoped he would sleep until morning. And with every twist and turn he made, my anxiety rose and fell. But as toddlers do, he rose hungry, rubbing circles on his belly. He was trying to be a big boy, trying to control the desperation I saw in his eyes. I nodded to my wife and gathered change from everywhere, anywhere, between cushions and under couches, closets, desks, and cabinet drawers. And I was off to shop with newly found pocket change, enough for instant noodles, Kool-Aid, bread, and peanut butter. Even as I counted out the change, and people in line smirked and commented, the cashier and I knew I didn't have enough. My eyes swelled, and I tried to control my desperation. She smiled and said, well, that's just enough. Bagged my food, and I left. Walking back to our little apartment, I will never forget that feeling. Emotion overcame me, not embarrassment or shame, just thankfulness, just love. I'd do anything for my boy. Testimony by BrianDonnell James. Thanks, Corey.
I was going to ask each speaker why they chose their work of art. There's no need to ask you. Stephen, I think we have images of yours and you'll guide us through them.
So this woman here is Miss Cynthia Brooks, and she is running her mother's center, the B. Gaddy Family Center. B. Gaddy was known as the Mother Teresa of Baltimore. She was very important. She actually started a home where houseless women and children could come and find a place to live, a refuge. She also created a furniture store so that people could pick up furniture. And every Thanksgiving, she would have these Thanksgiving dinners. And one very special thing about her is that because some people couldn't afford funerals or marriages, she actually ordained herself a minister so she could offer those weddings and funerals to people who couldn't be able to have those services. And unfortunately, she passed from breast cancer, but her child is able to continue her legacy and continue the dinners. And this was a project that was started by a MICA student, Ali Dugan, working with the B. Gaddy Family Center. And one of the things that's important to me as an artist is to uplift and to raise stories of people who may not be known. Many of you may not even know who B. Gaddy is. And so it was important for me to take this image of her mother and show the dignity that she displayed and how powerful she was in Baltimore. And so that's why I chose this particular piece.
Vaughn.
Hey, everybody.
That's just hanging.
Okay, making sure this is the right image. Yes. Thank you all so much for being here and for the humans on the internet. I'm feeling very inspired by Hiram and by Stephen. the things that y'all chose. Thanks, Corby. So I am Vaughn Diaz, and I am a documentarian, food writer, a radio producer, and I'm working on my second cookbook, which is called Islas, a celebration of tropical cooking. And I chose two images that I'll explain and put in context to this panel. So writing a cookbook is a rather complicated thing. There is writing of stories, there's writing of recipes. Recipes take an interminable amount of time to write and edit and get right, because 1 tablespoon of salt is different than 1 teaspoon of salt, and you have to get that right. And so when I had the opportunity to write my next cookbook, I wanted it to be one that, so what Stephen was saying, would highlight people who we don't know about. And I'm from Puerto Rico, but I was raised in the South, and there are millions and millions and millions of tropical islanders who are quite isolated, who live very interesting lives, very remote lives, and who are, to me, some of the most impressively creative, resilient, and powerful human beings on this planet. It's, growing up in a hurricane zone year after year, finding ways to feed yourself and your family makes you really powerful and really strong. So I wanted to, in this, and I'll speak a little bit more about this book as we go through the panel, but my goal was to highlight these people that we don't often or ever hear about, and in many ways to restore dignity to communities that are so often misunderstood or misrepresented. So there are 6 islands featured in this book. They are, among many, many others. The recipes, I think, run the gamut, but it is all tropical islands all over the planet, so the whole center of the globe. And the islands are Curacao, Puerto Rico, Madagascar, the Seychelles, Guam, and Vanuatu. And this image here is from Madagascar. This is a young man whose mother is the first and only woman to be invited to serve on the Fishing Council, the Fishing Association, for her entire series of remote coastal villages in Madagascar. And she's from Marauta. And so this image I brought because I think often in terms of the wide shot and the close-up, right? So this first image is a close-up of her oldest son, who is here looking at a pot of yuca or cassava that's boiling. For those that don't know, cassava is one of the most important staple root vegetables on the planet, and it also has to be prepared in a particular way, otherwise it can make you sick. So for the folks in Marauta, who are of the Vezo tribe, they eat cassava basically every day, often prepared in this way, right? Boiled, often with perhaps just a bit of fish to season it. And for to this idea of restoring dignity, right? Someone might look at this image and think, gosh, that's all they have to eat, right? Or, oh, that doesn't look particularly delicious, it looks rather plain. But the image, like back to the art piece, is so beautiful. And you may see in his eyelashes, a bit of light caught his eyelash and kind of, I don't know, give him a kind of ethereal look, right? So here we have just a beautiful young man who's looking over one of the most important foods to his people and really loving it. And we can go to the next slide. So this is the wide shot, right? There we have Perline Ernestine, who is his mother. The clay mask that she has on her face is both for beauty and for protection from insects and the sun. And then those are her children. So again, I'll close with this image. Many may look at this and see, children are not wearing shoes. They are eating on a mat that looks that it has stains, perhaps some dirt, but it looks just delicious. It looks just lovely. It looks like a beautiful family moment, right? And so in my work, I try to use art, most often photography, but also design elements to inform people who are looking at the book, but also to kind of give you a pause, right? What do I know about Madagascar? What do I know about these people? What are the preconceived notions that I had about this community? And maybe offer you a slightly different look.
That's great. And you were actually the first person I'm going to question, so keep that mic up. And I know that we've spoken. First of all, I have to say, Katie Workman's family and Katie have helped bring to light some of the best and cookbooks we've used the most often in the past decades, really, in all of our adult lives. So we know how complicated writing cookbooks is and producing them. You spoke of how equally important photography was to you when you were doing this book. Of course, you're a documentary filmmaker, you're very visually oriented. So could you talk about the selection process that went in to create these moving images? And then, I haven't prepared you for this question, so I'm giving you a curveball, which is, you wish to uplift misunderstood, impoverished people, to give them their dignity and make us understand where that dignity is. And you also want to entice people to actually eat and make this food, right? So is that a tough line to tread as you write this book? So photography and then both enlightening and appetizing.
Thank you. That's a great question. I'm not scared. On the choice of photography, I'm glad you asked that question because just as much as the images themselves were important to me, the way that I acquired the images was particularly important to me. I want to shout out the photo curator for my forthcoming book. Her name is Sibel Kodish, and I believe that she's online. So if anyone in the digital audience has questions for her, add those questions to the chat. So when I started working on this project, I was like, oh dear, the planet, right? The planet in a particular place. How am I going to do this? I very ambitiously thought, I'll just go. I'll go to all these places. I'll take Sibel. We'll do it. They're very far. Guam and Vanuatu are near Fiji, right? They are literally a whole day away. And when it comes to thinking about a production of a video or photography, you have to think about the equipment. You have to think about electricity, lighting, right? It got rather complicated. And so very quickly in the process, Sibel and I agreed that we were going to work with as many local photographers as we could, and that would take an additional process, right? And so she was my partner in looking at each of the places that we ultimately decided to go, but I'll focus on Madagascar, and to really start to just look on the internet and on social media at photographers in the area who had a style that we liked, and also a style that would work throughout the book. So it was important that there be some sense of continuity, because, and this is sort of the design element of sort of where I engage with art, the design, it should all flow, right? Because when you open a book, you want to just keep going through the pages, and the viewer will often, if something looks a little different or is distracting, it might stop them from continuing to look at the book, right? It's the same principle as websites. You want to just make sure that people really want to stick around. And so Pauline, oh, who's still there? Pauline, we learned about Pauline through the World Wildlife Federation, specifically in Madagascar. They do tremendous work on agriculture, in particular, sort of mangrove protection, tree planting, endangered species. And they recommended Riha Ramanaji, if I'm pronouncing his name properly, who had traveled to this village many times. I should have mentioned earlier, this village is only accessible by water. There are no roads. And so this specific photographer had gone out at least twice to do work for the World Wildlife Federation. As you can imagine, a remote community in Madagascar probably speaks a different language, right? And so the Vezo people have a specific dialect. So here's where we ran into a problem. I speak English, moderate French, total Spanish. The people in Madagascar speak French, sometimes, and various dialects. And then we have Pauline and her family speak a specific dialect. So I ultimately loved Riha's work. And we hired him, and we had him basically just capture everything that he could, right? Because what I found through working with him was that his eyes, photographers speak this way often about their work, right? The camera is the eye for many photographers. So his eyes would see things that I couldn't see because he knew these people, right? He had engaged with them before. He's familiar with their circumstances and their backgrounds. And so I knew that I was sending a friend to capture everything he possibly could want to capture about this place. And so in addition to these kinds of images, there's also gorgeous photography of these ships that they're seafaring people, right? So have these beautiful boats with sails that are constructed from recycled fabric, all stitched together. There's baobab trees, which are so cool looking. And then you also saw scenes of like people hanging out, children dancing, women applying this mud mask, a sewing machine that looks like it's from the 1920s, you know, just very, very cool. And so through working with Riha, who also did us an honor and translated from French to local dialect so he could conduct the interview along with some of his colleagues, brought us back this treasure. And it's really a treasure. He sent way more images than I had even contracted him for. And I knew when I was looking at the images that I would be proud to share them in the book and with the world, because I'm also lifting up Riha simultaneously.
And you actually want people to cook this food. You think that
Exactly.
discovering and helping share this food is something you want your readers to do?
Absolutely. Yeah, and so one of the dishes, I'll sort of end there so I'm not taking up too much time. The dish that you see here, I basically did an adaptation of this dish. Pauline calls this cassava with fish. And it's a little bit of oil, a little bit of curry, a local fish that they farm, or that they catch, and then you put that over boiled yuca. And so I looked at the images, and the images taught me how to make the dish, because I couldn't call her and ask her, right? Like, how much curry, how much oil, you know? So I had to ask the photographer to tell me, what did it smell like? What did it taste like? What was the texture? And then I have these beautiful images to zoom in and be like, okay, I think that's a 1-inch dice, maybe, right? But so through this process, again, of like honoring this simplicity of this dish, I was able to learn how to prepare something. It is quite delicious. And now there's a recipe in the book that goes
How
along with it.
fabulous. This is reverse engineering a dish, which some of us do with our own family recipes that have become inaccessible to us. Stephen, you've recently done a monumental series of works, 30 works, I think, called Declaration of Resistance, in which labor is a backdrop to demonstrate the role of African Americans in building our country's economy. Katie and others said we've all missed the opportunity of a lifetime to see this, so we can spend the rest of our lives regretting it. But we hope we're
Check my
going to
website.
see many images online and then even a bit on them. But the role of labor and the idea of celebrating what's obviously been enormously arduous and difficult. Can you talk about that tension between difficulty and hardship and celebration?
Yeah, I come from a working class family in South Carolina, so and everybody worked, so I sort of had that experience. And I often tell people that, like, artists, like, very few of us make it. And I spent a lot of time not making it. As soon as I graduated from school, I just started working. I worked a lot of laborious jobs. I've worked in factories. I've worked in after-school programs, Boys and Girls Club. And that's sort of like what made me interested in doing all this stuff around labor, because I myself was a laborer and working with these people. When we were talking about food, the arts, like, it's very important to know that a lot of art students that graduate, like, one of their first jobs is working at after school programs. So you're way of advocating for people is feeding children. And a lot of those times, those children that may be their second meal of the day. So it's always important about advocating for food justice. And so with this last series of works, during COVID, we were all sort of locked down, but there were people that were working in the background, our food deliverers, our cooks, our nurses, our doctors. And in this particular exhibition, I wanted to make sure that I highlighted those people pre-Civil War up till the 50s and 60s, because like Don was talking about, it's important to highlight people that are sort of invisible in the background, because everything that we have today, everything that we're experiencing now, sitting in this lovely room, is because people in the background have worked behind us to make sure that we can have this pleasurable experience.
And can you describe a little more your historical sources? And you concentrated, I think, on 3 states, including your own native South Carolina?
Yes, I focused a lot on Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and South Carolina. South Carolina was sort of like one of the birthplaces of the slave trade and labor and cotton and indigo, and Pennsylvania, West Virginia is sort of the birthplace of steel. And this is how New York got built, because all these coal miners provided the steel. So it's highlighting these people in the background who have made our lives what it is now.
And the period, it starts before the Civil War, I think?
Before the Civil War, I highlight this woman named Ona Judge, who was an enslaved woman for the Washingtons who escaped. And I go on all through the 50s, and I talk about Pennsylvania and South Carolina and other areas there.
Did food come up as a profession, as a way of earning a living in this? Did you choose to represent any workers in food?
Definitely, because a lot of African Americans were only able to go to trade schools. And so trade schools were where you learn those activities like cooking. And cooks, I looked at a lot of images, very surprisingly, of cooks in summer camps, which I had sort of never even thought of how important cooks are, and our cafeteria workers are there. So it's a very important and very integral in everything that we do.
And were all the places where the African-American cooks were working segregated?
Pretty much. And sometimes they were serving people and at the tables that they could not be at. One of the women that I highlighted was Elsie Henderson, and she worked for the Kaufmans, who owned Falling Water in Pennsylvania. When they were in Pittsburgh, Elsie would call the Kaufmans, figure out what they had eaten before they come to Falling Water, and then sort of provide the services that they didn't get in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh, to Falling Water. And oftentimes, she was always that person in the background that was making sure everything was in place for the Kaufmans. And it's these stories and she wasn't able to eat at the table that she served.
But when you go to Falling Water and they take you into the kitchen, they talk a lot about that woman.
Yes.
And they design the kitchen specifically around her and her needs.
Yes, exactly.
But still.
Another fascinating story where it's not until recently where people are able to highlight these people in the background who provide services and made our lives better.
Wow. Hiram, hunger has been so much a focus of the art you yourself have done and that you've chosen. How did you get interested in hunger, and can you sort of guide us through how it appears, different facets of it as you go through different poetry?
Sure. If I could take just a second, though, to riff off of some of Stephen's comments as well. I also was lucky enough to receive a writing residency at what is called Woodlawn Estate Plantation, which is just across the Potomac from Mount Vernon, on property that was owned by George Washington and his family. In fact, a great step-granddaughter of his built the property Woodlawn. Why am I mentioning this? I took a writer residency there, and within just a few days of being there, realized that there was much more here than I had realized in taking on the residency. To make a long story short, I invited 4 wonderful friends, African-American poets from the DC area, to come and write about their experience. Woodlawn was lived in by 9 whites, served by 90 slaves, of whom nothing basically is known other than a few first names. Well, of the 4 African-American poets I invited, one said, Hiram, I can't. I simply can't do it. The 3 others were, and I completely understood, but the 3 others were brave enough to come, and they wrote something. We just stayed there for a day. They wrote some remarkable work, imagining the voices, the lives, the experiences, the sadness, the sorrows, the joys of those 90 slaves. And we have folded all of that material, included a harmonica player, as well as some amazing artwork created by one of the poets in a program called Voices of Woodlawn, which has now, thanks to Zoom, been shown worldwide. So I did want to call that out as well. Now, getting back to poetry of hunger, my background is in agriculture. I was very lucky to have an amazing career where I worked on international food insecurity and hunger issues. I was also writing poetry the entire time. But as I was mentioning to Vaughn, poets come out at night. They're like bats. And so I was working on the poetry at night and then going to the day job during the day, and never combined, really never combined the two. It wasn't that I wasn't proud of either one. It just, for some reason, I never wanted to combine the two. When I retired, I was asked to give a seminar out at Oregon State University on the poetry of hunger. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. So I did my homework in order to give that seminar and looked for poetry about hunger. There's a cartload of poetry, as you can well imagine, about hunger of the heart, hunger of the spirit, hunger of the soul. Very little. I found a few pieces, but very little about empty stomach poetry, hunger of the stomach. And so I thought, well, okay, maybe this is an area that I could help urge, rouse poets to bring their talents to bear, knowing that poetry has been used very effectively on other social fronts. Think of the new Colossus at the base of the Statue of Liberty that calls out more meaningfully now than perhaps ever America's welcoming to immigrants. That poem has made a difference over the years. And so I thought, okay, maybe we could do the same with poetry. And to make that very long story short, we now have about 400 poems from poets literally all over the world, of all ilks, ages, shapes, sizes, sports team affiliations, you name it. We've got a variety of poets represented with their work on the website. And more importantly than just writing and posting the poems, which is important, those poems are now being used by community groups, houses of worship, hunger leaders in their work as well. All sorts of groups, the United Nations has picked up and used them, and so they are being used. And most recently, we proved the point thanks to colleagues T.A. Niles in New Mexico and J.C. Wayne of the Pole Archery Project in New England. We proved that poetry of poems about hunger can actually be used to raise funds, for hunger, anti-hunger causes. We raised about $5,000, actually a bit more, for Feed the Children, auctioning artwork that had been created in response to some of the poems published on the website. And then about a month later, just simply had a poetry reading where we featured many of the poets from around the world on the Zoom, and we raised about $1,000 for a DC-based hunger group, anti-hunger group called Roots for Life. So poetry comes to me naturally. I have absolute trust and faith in its power to move. We need all the statistics, all the science, all the know-how about hunger and how to prevent it. But if we don't have something that grabs the heart, which data, trend lines simply don't, if we don't have the arts involved, we're missing a key tool in the toolkit. Thanks, Corby.
We can all applaud that, but we'll applaud later. We all have our own call to action based on, now we're going to give money to your poetry website, but don't worry, we won't share our strength. We have a great call to action. My fantastic colleagues, Julie, Nicole, and Mary, always send out a call to action. Anyone who's registered for Zoom will be getting it. You should all feel free to register because we want you to have it. That will, of course, have the website. And one of Julie's great questions, which you did see in advance, talks about the idea of art to foster empathy and a sense of human connection. Before I go down the panel, and I would like to come back this way, why is it that when hunger was this obvious subject, and so much of poetry is about various kinds of hunger, of the soul, for love, for connection, why do you suppose hunger for food was such a lack? And did your resident artists have to be led by the nose to contribute to this, or did they immediately see it as a suitable subject?
I simply cannot explain why there has been this lack of, maybe even hesitancy to write about hunger. My sense is, though, as I've participated in a number of hunger, anti-hunger conclaves, primarily from the kind of the science, how do we tweak this enzyme in the plant to have it produce more, or work with the livestock so that we can produce more around the world. And as I've worked with those kind of groups and mentioned the notion of adding poetry or the arts to the group, I get kind of a knitted brow. It's not that there's an unwillingness, it's just, really? Poetry? I don't know about that. But if I can get those folks to hang in there with me long enough to let them hear a young poet read spoken art, one of their poems, I don't have to do any more convincing at all. The poets will convince. So I think it's kind of a oil water sort of thing, Corby. I'm not exactly sure, but why it has traditionally not been the case that poets have stepped up or the hunger groups have maybe not been as welcoming. But all I can say is gratefully, that's changing now. And this is a perfect example. This conclave is a perfect example. There seems to be a willingness and openness. I'd like to live to see the day that US Department of Agriculture, the National Academy of Sciences, and other honorific as well as grant-making agricultural research groups include a dimension in their grants, in their grant calls for the arts. What a concept that would be if we could include the arts as kind of mashups, because I think explaining the sciences, engaging the public in the sciences, nothing better than the arts as a tool to do that.
That'll be the #1 item in our call to action. And we hope that any grant makers listening to this will listen up. Vaughn and then Stephen, the idea of images fostering empathy and human connection, and presumably as a documentarian, you chose that medium because of the power of images and empathy.
Absolutely. There's a bit of a tension here, right? Because to document a person who is living in less than favorable circumstances is a mighty task, right? And to use Pauline and her family as an example, they don't have consistent access to food there, right? They fish, they have plenty of cassava, sometimes they can get rice, sometimes they can trade and barter. But this is a community that is living with struggle. In addition, a big part of this book is about climate change and the way that climate change is impacting tropical island communities in particular. And so climate change is shrinking the coastline as it is all over the place. It is the mangroves are struggling, which is a major source of firewood and also various other natural elements. And so I think that, and I think I'm answering your question here. Um, it should, it needs to be done, even if it's tricky, even if it's complicated, even if there's tension, because we need to see what's happening, right? And you can take a beautiful image of a community that is struggling, like I would argue the one behind me is right now, and inspire someone to learn more about them, inspire them potentially to give, right? But I do think that the intentionality behind the process of capturing these images, the intentionality that Hiram has with his poetry as a result of the poverty and hunger that you've seen in the world, right? And Stephen's mission to lift up people who we often don't know about, it draws somebody in, right? The world needs all of us. It needs the people that draw people in, it needs the people who are working on the ground, it needs the fundraisers too. And what I'm finding in my career is that my unique vantage point sometimes allows me to see things in a way that other people don't see them. And so I try to walk through that open door and operate with intentionality so that I feel confident that I have done a good job.
That's great. Stephen, I'm going to have you transition to the next subject, and then you have to have questions ready. Got that? Ready. So, Stephen, not only the idea of fostering empathy and human connection, but then can that be used to move to action and a call to action and activism? And if so, in your case, what would that activism be?
Yeah, so for about 8 years, I worked as a project administrator and grants administrator at Maryland Institute College of Art, and I worked with faculty, students, and staff members that were doing community-based projects. Because Baltimore is a lot of neighborhoods that are food deserts, like that has been sort of a main component in a lot of students' projects. And me sort of being a Black person working with a lot of white students, I think that one of the things that I focused on was making sure that we have empathy when we do these projects. Oftentimes we would have to take tours in neighborhoods. And so one of the things that I sort of prepared students for was like, watch how you behave in these areas. These are communities in needs. You're going to be gone after 4 years, but how can you make an impact while you are here? I know people say do no harm, but you have to do little harm because there is harm when you come in and insert yourself into an environment. And so food justice was always sort of a component that a lot of our projects were based around, even graphic designers. One of the projects that we worked on was with this group called the Samaritan House, and they offer a food pantry, also clothes for houseless people, and the graphic designers worked on the campaign to help them further raise funds. So there are different ways that artists are being able to create action through their art form.
Wow. Hiram, did you have any specific activism you've seen any of your kind of resident poets lead to, or you've personally wished art would lead to?
This is kind of flowing into perhaps another question about what do I see in the coming months. We've been very excited here recently to have been asked to provide some of the poems off of the website for a large national and international anti-hunger group as they message about their initiatives, reason for being in programs. And so we're looking for more and more ways to activate the poetry, to bring it into the fold of providing either resources, funding, or motivation, action against hunger. And while I don't have a clear path forward in terms of what might be the next opportunity, working with some of these a little bit larger organizations to tap into the font of poetry to make their messaging that much more effective, I think is going to be one of the cool ways. We also have a musician, composer who's approached us. He's been commissioned by a fairly prominent music program at a university to develop a chorale piece for young people, and he chose a poem off of the website to use as the lyric for the composition. He's even mentioned the notion of having it perhaps in the running for a Grammy. Of course, I jumped out of my seat when he said something like that. But the point being, amplifying, using poetry to amplify the signal about the importance, the prevalence, the all too prevalent nature of the scourge called hunger is what we're all about, and finding new ways to do that.
Great. Vaughn, and then I'm going to invite questions. Has activism ever crossed your young mind?
I'll keep this brief, but I started my career as a social justice advocate, largely working with women survivors of violence, sexual violence, and domestic violence. And I became a storyteller because I found it very difficult to be in that space physically. My grandmother is a survivor, my mother's a survivor. It was too much for me to be there with them. But I found that I could tell stories about them, and that my storytelling would have a much greater impact than any one-on-one conversation, especially because I wasn't particularly effective in that role. Yes, my current project, which is a book, it's an object, but it has been a transformative learning experience. And now I have this object that I can use to pivot and to push forth conversations and to participate in conversations like this with folks like y'all to do the educating part. And something tangible, though, that's been coming to my mind quite often that I think will end up being my soapbox is that I really want to encourage people to travel differently. So tropical islands are some of the most touristed places. They are gorgeous. They are the epitome of paradise. People travel badly to those places. They leave tons of trash. Tourists leave 3 times the amount of garbage that citizens leave in their need to be disposed of. And so I keep finding all of these little examples of how you can travel differently. Take your trash with you when you leave. That's a thing that people have been encouraging folks to do. And also know that many of these economies are based on tourism. So I'm not saying don't go. I'm saying research, learn, know who these people are, try to learn a little bit of the language at the very least. Have a contingency plan. Don't expect for the hotel to be luxurious, right? And please, for the love of God, don't order salmon in a tropical island, because salmon comes from Arctic waters, right? It doesn't belong there. Order what's local, and then you'll have a more complete experience that is contributing to the local economy and ultimately honoring these people.
Great lessons we will all keep in mind. Audience questions, and we've got, I think, Nicole or Julie will be monitoring Zoom. We have Marie Bragg. I know all of your names, actually, because I'm a mind reader, but I know Bree.
This was such an incredible panel, and it feels like a moment I'll always remember, because as a researcher who's at NYU studying food policy, I think I and the teams that I work with are sort of guilty of this idea of not really thinking about the arts and how critical it is for drawing in hearts to do the thing we care about the most, which is, also work with policymakers to change policies to improve the environment. And what better way to start that dialogue than to feature some of the very work that you're describing here? And so I just want to say how powerful it has been to hear about your work, and thank you for it. And in that spirit, and Stephen, I think you touched on this a little bit when you were talking about students, what are some things we can do, either together or your advice on how for upcoming generations of students and scholars who are in the arts or maybe in different aspects of the sciences, how do we bridge the gap earlier so that someone who is, has sort of been doing research for a while gets this baked into their ethos very early on and just takes it as an inherent need?
I think one of the sort of important things is to have volunteer opportunities, but also in those volunteer opportunities, make sure that there is a community leader that invites you into that space. I often see students go and insert themselves in spaces without sort of the community buy-in or finding someone to buy into what they're doing, and then they sort of wreak havoc in the area. And so for me, it's always been important, and what I have learned is to always have community buy-in from a specific person that has been in that place for a long time, not someone that's moved there 2 years ago or so.
Have given us a lot to think about. We at Food and Society do a whole food as medicine initiative in which researchers come into communities to improve the diet. And when you say you always do harm, just do less harm, that's something we're really going to be swiping with no attribution ever to Stephen Towns. I'm kidding. Of course, we're going to attribute you, but these are such thought-provoking ideas. Stephen, you've also worked with young children. And so to Marie's question about how do you get them aware of this early, can you think of a way?
I don't know, honestly. I think sort of the thing is just making sure that you develop a relationship, and it sort of starts with one student, because a lot of times when you're working with groups of students, like, it's going to be havoc. And so I think what I've always told students or people working on projects is to be kind with yourself. If you've reached one person through that project, then you've done your work. It's sort of that whole butterfly effect, because you can't change the world with a single project. It's that one person.
It's an interesting question too on college campuses. I know of at least one university, and there probably are several, but I know for sure of one that provides very, very modest, small scholarships for students who are either in the sciences and want to do something collaborative in the arts, or in the arts and want to do something collaborative in the sciences. And much to, I think, everyone's surprise, the applications, first off, were numerous for this kind of support. And second, it wasn't that any of the students were creating something wholly anew. They had been working already in the sciences, 1 foot in the sciences and 1 foot in the arts already. This simply was the first time that anyone had acknowledged through support for them to do that kind of work. So I think many young people, many people generally, are interested in this area. It's just that the funders, so far, for whatever reason, have not picked up on the fact that we need all tools in the toolkit. We need all of them, including the arts. And if we don't have the arts included, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. We're holding our hands behind our back. We just simply need all of that creativity and innovation, and the young people especially are waiting in the wings to demonstrate it.
Can I say one more thing? Another thing that I found very important is managing expectations. Be very transparent about what you're doing and the effect that you can have. Being sort of overly ambitious and voicing that, and you can really disappoint a lot of people when you are over ambitious and you promise all these things and you don't. And so it's very important, like being communicative all the time and managing their expectation of what you can offer.
Yeah. I am I think y'all saw me taking notes. I have like so many wonderful quotes from both of y'all. Wanted to ask, do you know Crystal Diaz? She's at getting her PhD at NYU in food studies. She's an amazing person. She's Puerto Rican and doing some really cool stuff. One very specific thing that I've seen in North Carolina that I think is a wonderful model is there is a chef named Andrea Rusig, who is well known, highly regarded, a wonderful human being. She has a restaurant in Chapel Hill.
A lantern?
The Lantern, and Lantern, I think. Andrea has this program, and I cannot remember at this moment what it's called, but it's really, really brilliant, where students, regular students in public schools in the Triangle area, can apply to be a part of a program where they receive groceries to prepare a meal that coincides with a chef who is online or in person to walk them through how to prepare the meal. And she does a very good job of curating the chefs that come up. So I am not a chef, I'm a home cook, I'm self-taught, but she brought me in to do one and was like, so many of my students are Latino or Puerto Rican. And so that's the extra advocacy, right? Yes, you're providing food, so we know there's nourishment. You're teaching how to prepare a dish, which is like, that's the greatest skill on the planet. And then you're also, again, it's like this incredible moment of giving dignity back to these communities and for them to feel so good. And then they get to eat a meal at the end of it. It's a really cool model.
This is wonderful. And we're going to go from that to our last question, which is what gives you hope and what makes you hopeful in the art you're doing or what you're seeing? And we're going to go Hiram to Stephen.
I remain hopeful given the groundswell of interest in the arts, and in my case specifically in the written arts, the poetry, the groundswell of interest among the poetry community and the anti-hunger community's willingness to receive, use, put to use those poems. I remain very, very hopeful. Will poetry solve hunger? No, no, no. I don't believe it can. Will it help? I absolutely believe it can. I believe it can change minds, open up hearts as well as wallets and purses, and make people realize in ways that perhaps they never did that hunger not only can touch them, but touches absolutely somebody that they know. And so I remain hopeful that there is an opening up of willingness to bring, in this case, the poetic arts to the anti-hunger cause.
Young people give me a lot of hope, actually. I think all the time. I also have been a college professor in the past, in addition to other things I do. And my students were always like so much better informed than I was at their age. Even, for an 18-year-old male student to articulate that he understands misogyny as a principle shocked me. Right? Because these were, but yes, the thing that gives me the most hope is that we have a generation of young people who have so much information that we didn't have. And while that may feel overwhelming to them, they are going to come up with solutions we could never have imagined because they've known things for longer.
And I echo what she said. And they're incorporating it in their videos and their YouTube videos and their TikToks. And so I think this is sort of the catalyst.
And our hope is that we are surrounded by so many fantastic, active, thoughtful, engaged people who joined us today. I know each of you is that way, and all of you online are that way. We love doing this series. This has been one of the very best. What fun to have it in person. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to Roosevelt House for making this so much fun for all of us to do. Again, Julie and Nicole and all of our Share Our Strength colleagues. And of course, Elliot, Ann, and Katie, we're so grateful to all of you. And thank you all for joining us today. Look out for our call to action and keep signing up for more. And what fun to have all of you here. Thanks so much.